I was at the White House recently, and it reminded me not only of all the living mementos that were all over the place, but the examples of all of those men who have passed through that house and what they left us. How can you incorporate their pattern of success and wisdom into your own life? Esteemed presidential historian Talmadge Boston will tell us. And I'll give you a little tour of the Oval Office, all on this edition of Arroyo Grande. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Welcome to Arroyo Grande. I was in the White House recently, and I have to tell you, it never fails to impress me. Everywhere you turn is history. Everywhere you look, there's a touchstone if you know what you're looking for. By the way, go subscribe right now to the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and turn those notifications on. I don't want you to miss an episode. Anyway, we were shooting an interview at the White House, and Laura and the Angle crew and I were in the diplomatic room. I was kind of in awe because that is the fireplace that Franklin Delano Roosevelt installed in 1935 to conduct his fireside chats during World War II. The room is used formally to welcome diplomats and state visitors. The cool antique wallpaper on the walls there, that blue antique wallpaper, it dates back to 1834 and it was installed by Jackie Kennedy. President Trump then took us down to the Oval Office.
I'm in the portico of the White House, and, well, you know what this room is.
So here's a question I ask. So Reagan has a place of prominence, and George Washington has a place of prominence. And I've asked this question maybe 200 times. People come in. I said, so who would you put in the place of prominence, George Washington or Ronald Reagan? Who would you put?
Washington.
So far, it's 219-0.
President Trump has kind of turned the place into his own blinged-out presidential museum. There are, by my count, 20 portraits now hanging in the Oval Office, as well as some added gold here and there, and an original copy of the Declaration of Independence. Portraits of Washington, FDR, Reagan, and yes, Lincoln surround the president all day long. What amazed me was his familiarity with his predecessors and Trump's veneration of them and what they contributed to the country. And I guess they tell us something about this president. For instance, he has a portrait I noticed on the far wall across from the Resolute desk of James Polk. Okay, it's next to the fireplace. Well, Polk expanded the U.S. incredibly. He annexed Texas from the Mexicans. He claimed the whole Southwest region and California. And Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Montana, all of that became part of the United States due to James Polk. So you see the connection there to President Trump. There's also a portrait of, and this was an odd one for me. At first, I didn't even recognize the person, but it was a portrait of William Henry Harrison, whom I asked the president about.
But Harrison died 29 days after he made the inauguration speech. It was freezing cold, and he died. And you had the Civil War. He was the strongest proponent against
war. He was a peacemaker,
Yeah. Would have been different. And then you wouldn't know about Abraham Lincoln. But you wouldn't have known about him either.
No, I wouldn't have known.
Because when you solve wars, unfortunately, you don't get the same credit.
President Trump in person, I have to tell you, he's disarming, hilarious, always on point. And you know what his superpower is? He speaks like every other guy does. There's no pretense. He will meet you wherever you are, whether highborn, middle, or low, he's there. It's incredible, really, also to see the White House and to see it up close for as long as we were there. But that visit got me thinking about what lessons could we learn, you and I, from all the presidents who've preceded Trump? Which brings us to our deep dive. I sat down with a presidential historian, Talmadge Boston, who wrote a book called How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents, and he offered quite a few of those lessons. Tell me about applied history. There's a lot of people watching, tuning in, listening, and they say, this is stuff that happened so long ago. It doesn't. This has no application in my life.
Well, I think that's why people aren't paying enough attention to history these days, because they don't realize how useful it is if you not only read it and enjoy it, but think, how can I apply what these heroic figures did to my life? And that's what my book, How the Best Did It, Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents, attempts to do, is to say, here were the three greatest traits that made Thomas Jefferson such a great president, or John F. Kennedy, or Franklin Roosevelt, or George Washington. But at the end of every question, chapter, there's a series of questions called personal application for the reader to ask him or herself, how am I doing in these leadership traits that made this president so great that I just read about? Let's
dive into some of these. Some of them I was very familiar with. Others surprised me. George Washington, not the success on the battlefield initially that he would end up being to great acclaim. How did he learn from his mistakes? You say he profited from those mistakes.
Well, most people, when they think about George Washington and why he's such a heroic figure, is because at the end of the Revolutionary War, he left power behind. I want to go back to Mount Vernon. I don't want to be the leader. And then, of course, after he left the presidency, his second term, I want to go back to Mount Vernon. I don't want a third term. But he had learned his lesson during the French and Indian War when he'd been our most courageous American soldier fighting for the British. But because he deemed himself to be so courageous, he kept leaning on his superiors. Hey, I need a promotion. I need advancement. And they rejected him. And he learned the lesson. Don't be an obnoxious self-promoter. Let others be the people in the business of promoting you. And for the rest of his life, that's why he's famous, because he never promoted himself after his Revolutionary War heroics or his presidency heroics. He let other people sing his praises.
And he let the deeds and the actions speak for him.
Absolutely.
Tell me, he was also, in your book, you describe him, Ron Chernow's book also describes him in a similar fashion, as a strong, silent type. How did that benefit him? How could we benefit from that?
I think we could all benefit from the concept of less is more. Washington was a great listener. Washington knew he was not a great public speaker. He had two strikes against him. Number one, he had a soft, breathy voice that came from a childhood respiratory illness. And secondly, by the time he was president, he only had one tooth in his head. So if you go to the museum at Mount Vernon, you see George Washington's dentures, you say, how could anybody talk with that bird cage in their mouth? But anyway, he learned when to speak, and more importantly, how much to listen. He was a great decision maker. He was not a great debater. So during his presidency with Hamilton on one side and Jefferson on the other, and they're arguing all the time, Washington would not take sides. He saw himself as the nation's unifier in chief. I'm not going to take sides. You guys go back to your office, submit a detailed position paper on these issues you're arguing about, give it to me. I'll make the final decision, but that was his approach to trying to keep the country unified.
Yeah. You talk about, when you mentioned Hamilton and Jefferson, I know I'm a huge Hamiltonian and a big Alexander Hamilton fan. Long before the musical, I was collecting his works and in New York, followed his career there. Tell me about how Washington, in the book you say, he was the conscience in chief. And Jefferson observed that his greatest character trait was prudence. Tell me about that. What can we benefit from? How can we take something from that example of prudence and character?
Well, character and conscience in chief, it's all about integrity. It's all about telling the truth. It's all about when you speak publicly, the next day we don't need fact checkers. And so Washington believed that starting off the nation's new president, if we're going to stand for anything, we better stand for integrity. And so that was something that he would never compromise, and one of the reasons he was so revered throughout his lifetime. But in terms of prudence, back to what I was saying, a great decision maker, a capacity to see what's in the best interest of the country, not one side or the other, but the country. And that's why we revere him so much.
But these men had flaws. And Washington had flaws, which you don't shy away from.
Well, in every chapter, I have a section on that president's flaws, because I don't want anybody on a pedestal. I want people who read this book to say, this guy had all kinds of flaws, but he did great things. Right. Well, you and I, we have all kinds of flaws, but we're capable of doing great things if we'll tie into these leadership traits.
Yeah. Well, what's the danger of, and I hear this all the time, I mean, you hear it in classrooms, I hear it when I visit classrooms. There's a presentism that has gripped, I think, America, where we evaluate the past based on our present mores, our present history, our present cultural appetites. What's the danger there for a student of history? Can you really embrace history if you come with the bias of the present?
No, absolutely not. And so that's why people who own slaves, like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, people are taking their statues down. And that's unfortunate because in their era, of course, slavery was permitted under the Constitution. And if you have a great big plantation in Virginia, as both Washington and Jefferson did, there's no labor force. You can't possibly have enough children to be able to take care of these massive plantations. There's no infusion of European workers. And so because it was legal, it was constitutional, the only source of a big labor force to be able to work your plantation, hopefully make money out of it, they had slaves. And most of the plantation owners in the South had that. And if people aren't aware of those economic circumstances, then they have lost the truth, as far as I'm concerned, as to why did these guys do this? Not because they were evil, not because they were immoral, but because they were living in the real world in their time, and not with a 21st century social consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the evil of slavery, I mean, Adams was aware of it. I mean, you have the founding fathers wrestling with the inhumanity and the evil of slavery. But it was an economic reality that they dealt with and they embraced, and it was a practice until it wasn't. Tell me for a moment about Jefferson. When you mentioned George Washington a minute ago, I didn't realize, you taught me a lot about Thomas Jefferson. I didn't realize he wasn't a great speaker. I always thought in my mind, reading the debates of he and Alexander Hamilton, that he was this great orator. He wasn't. What did that teach you? What should it teach us?
Well, he had a soft voice. He couldn't project. And of course, we were more than a century away from microphones. He was great one-on-one. He was great in small groups. He was charming. He was conversational. He was a genius. He knew how to get people to work together, and that was the great triumph of his presidency. The country had been so divided during Adams' presidency, and Washington and Jefferson would host these dinners with people from both sides. We're not going to talk about hot-button issues. We're going to drink wine. We're going to eat food. We're going to talk about what we do for a living, what our hobbies are, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to talk about the things people talk about when they're trying to make friends. Mm-hmm. And it didn't happen at the first dinner, but he had 2 to 3 dinners every week for 8 years.
Because he preferred those intimate, smaller gatherings, because he could convince people one-on-one.
And because he knew that's how you get people to think in terms of being unified as opposed to being divided. That if I decide I like you, I'm more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And for me to decide I like you, I have to know you. I have to socialize with you. I have to know what you really like. What do you talk about? What do you tell jokes about? What's your sense of humor? And all that came through in these Jefferson dinners. Yeah. And fortunately, there's a movement in this country right now, if you Google Jefferson dinners, people all over the country realizing how polarized we are, saying, we need to do something different. We need to have a level of harmony and capacity, mutual respect.
Civility.
Civility. Mm-hmm. And that was the great triumph of Jefferson and those dinners that brought the country back together. And of course, he's got 8 years presidency. His best friend Madison follows for 8 years. Then Monroe, the little brother figure, another 8 years. So it carried the country. It got the country moving in the right direction.
And gelled the country in a way. But it was from those intimate gatherings, and that struck me. We don't have those. We're deprived of those. I mean, well, you and I live in the South, so we're different creatures. But in many parts of the country, there's that division. You don't have that kind of unity, and sharing meals is not as treasured as it is, I would argue, in parts of the South.
Well, you think about Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
You think about how it was 30, 40 years and long before that people who are in Congress lived there.
Yeah.
And their wives and their spouses knew each other, and their kids played ball together, and they would run into each other in restaurants and do all that to build relationships. Now, if you're in Congress, you spend maybe 4 days a week there. The other 3 days, you got to be back home raising money constantly.
And your family's usually
And your
there.
family's there, so you don't have these relationships, and that's why there's such hostility between the party, because people don't know each other on that kind of social level.
There's a line in the book I love where you talk about the empire of the imagination that Jefferson had. How did he feed that, and what can we mere mortals learn from his example.
Well, when you think about the word imagination in the context of politics, you think about long-term vision. What are the possibilities? And of course, he was brilliant. He was well-read. He knew his history from all over Europe, the history of the world. And so he could think of different options along with his best friend, James Madison. And that's what they did. And so Madison there, at the father of the Constitution, that's where his focus is. And Jefferson got this brand new country. What do we want it to be? What are our ideals? What do we want to persuade people to move their lives toward? And obviously, if you got imagination, you can think of many different options that potentially are going to provide great benefit for the country.
And that splendid isolation you're right about. He would take time alone. When you go to Monticello, you see it. He's got the bed and that kind of sitting, that round sitting room with his desk, which he could turn and you know, follow the sunlight so it wouldn't abandon him. I mean, the brilliance of that mind, but taking the time to feed it and be alone with his thoughts.
Solitude is the key. Talk to anybody who's creative. They don't do it in noisy places. They don't do it amidst distractions. They do it in solitude. And Jefferson understood that. And that's where you have reflection. That's where your imagination can run wild. That's why I write books. It is a creative outlet. And I don't write books in noisy places.
You don't? When do you write?
I write early in the morning in my home between 4 and 7:30 a.m. when there's no noise, there's no emails, there's no phone calls, and all I can do is think about what I'm reading, researching, and writing.
You don't write in public places at all. You don't go to coffee shops.
No.
See, I need the din of a coffee shop
Okay.
to get that isolation. At home, I'm too distracted. The phone, the kids, whoever. It's a distraction. Anyway, a trusted peer. How important is a trusted peer, a sounding board? Jefferson had Monroe.
Well, had Madison.
And Madison, James Madison.
That's right.
Tell me about that relationship and how important a trusted peer is for anybody, a citizen, but particularly an entrepreneur, a leader.
Well, particularly somebody who's in the business of ideas and public policy. Jefferson was a dreamer. Jefferson had a lot of unrealistic ideas. They were fun, they were exciting, but Madison would bring them down to earth. Right. Madison, on the other hand, was so grounded, he wasn't particularly creative. So they had this wonderful symbiotic relationship where one's providing the imagination, the other one's keeping feet on the ground, head in the clouds, feet on the ground, and together made the best of all worlds. 2 + 2 = 5.
How did he deal with divisions? Washington dealt with kind of letting everybody fight it out. How did Jefferson deal with divisions in the country, political differences, and in his cabinet?
Well, he wasn't in the business of traveling around the country the way Washington did, but he was in the business of taking the representatives from Congress, and as I mentioned, having these dinners and building these relationships, knowing these were the people who were the representative of those people all over the country, who would know what the public sentiment was of the people in their constituency, and he could direct his policies based on that knowledge of the sentiment and finding ways to make it more appealing based on his vision for the entire country.
I want to move on to Lincoln, who is a great figure that I will confess, as a child growing up in New Orleans, Lincoln was not regarded as the greatest figure of all time, and there's still the rumbles of the Civil War that ran through. But when you look at this record, when you look at what he did and accomplished, his achievement is untouched, unmatched.
Well, there's so many ways to look at it, but here's a guy who had less than 1 year of formal schooling in the blab school as a child when everybody's talking simultaneously, nobody's learning anything, and yet he becomes our most eloquent president. Why? How? Well, he was a voracious reader his entire life. Being from a poor family that only had 3 or 4 books in the house, true of all his neighbors too, but they were the King James Bible. They were Shakespeare's plays. They were books of the great poets. They were Aesop's fables. And because he had a photographic memory, he could remember all this stuff and could work Shakespeare into conversations and speeches and the parables, the lessons of Aesop's fable. So he thought in those terms. I like stories, but I like stories that teach a lesson.
Tell me about, you talk about the great magnanimity of Lincoln. I call it the mercy of Lincoln. Talk to me about that. This is kind of I think, underexplored part of Lincoln's gift to the country.
Magnanimity means you are great of spirit. It means you always take the high road. It means you're forgiving. You turn the other cheek. You don't take the bait. And so Lincoln, he's got this team of rivals cabinet who start out hostile, and most of them come around. He's got these goofy Union generals, particularly McClellan and then Meade, who don't do what they're supposed to do. He's got this very difficult wife, Mary. He's got the southern states who are seceding, even though he says, I'm going to let you keep slavery. So he has all these different constituencies who are giving him all kinds of friction, all kinds of reasons to get angry and retaliate, and he never does. He takes the high road always, and he also has equanimity. He's always calm. He doesn't explode, under control, despite this war going on that's going to, 750,000 people are going to lose their lives. Millions are going to be wounded, amputees, et cetera, et cetera. And losing a child.
Well, that's what I was about to bring up. Willie. His son Willie dies in the White House.
He gets past the grief. He gets past Mary's daily craziness. He gets past all the tensions on all fronts from politics, and always has his eye on the ball. We got to win the war. We got to bring an end to slavery. We got to bring the country back together again, and never losing sight of the big picture.
Talk for a moment about people ignore this, have forgotten it, or never were taught it. After the war, the mercy that Lincoln shows the Confederate States, even when his own generals, his own cabinet was like, no, go and take it over. Go crush it. But he has a great line. I wrote it down. If you don't win the peace, you don't win the war. He was focused on that. How did that mercy extend to those southern states that were in rebellion?
Well, unfortunately, he was killed very shortly after Appomattox. But in terms of his vision for how he wanted the country to be unified, he knew for the southern states who've been killing each other, killing us, and vice versa, to come around, they've got to feel like we are merciful, to use your good word, and that we are forgiving.
And you're part of the Union.
And that we want them to succeed in their lives and their businesses and their families. And Lincoln's whole perspective was, we're going to make that happen. We're going to view them in a way that'll be constructive and that they'll want to play ball and reunite. Unfortunately, because he was assassinated so shortly into his second term, and then the disastrous Andrew Johnson followed, and it all went to hell. But in terms of what Lincoln's vision was...
But returning the property to them after the war, which was something that some were advising him, take the property, take it all. But he thought, if you pledge fidelity to the Union, you can have your property back. We'll be brothers again. Well, heal up the wounds.
It's kind of a forerunner to the Marshall Plan. Yeah. It's like after World War II, we want these people to be our allies. We need to take care of them. They need to have good lives. They need to feel good toward us. And that's exactly what was Lincoln's attitude as it was in the Marshall Plan.
Tell me about his... He really had a fantastic focus on mission beyond the strife at home, the pain he was going through. I mean, I tell the story in my book on Tad Lincoln and Lincoln that he would sign those pardons and hear those pardons all night long. People would line up outside the White House. The Union soldiers that had run from the field, the parents would come plead his mercy, and he would give them pardons. 88% he gave pardons to. And Tad Lincoln's next to the desk watching all of this, which is kind of an interesting, back and forth, how he taught his son through his example. But speak about the focus on mission, how the mission and what he was about was bigger than any of the side.
Well, I mean, he was aware that people make mistakes. People are flawed. And are you just going to destroy their lives because they made a mistake? Or are you going to think of ways to rehabilitate them, give them a second chance? And that's what those pardons were all about. I mean, fighting in that war was as hell on earth as you can imagine. Obviously, it was very dangerous. The conditions were terrible. You're away from your family forever. You have friends and loved ones being killed. And for somebody to say, I don't think I want to be a part of this anymore, on the one hand is cowardly, doesn't support the effort, but it's understandable, and maybe the guy can come around and have a useful life thereafter. That was Lincoln's thinking.
Tell me about promises and delivering on promises, which is a big focus in your book and a big part of Lincoln's presidency.
Right. Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said if I had to boil them all down into 4 words, it's make and keep promises. And that's what Lincoln did. First and foremost, the promise he kept to marry. They had been engaged. He had realized, I'm not sure this is right. He broke off the engagement. He nearly had a nervous breakdown, but he came back and realized, as a matter of honor, I've got to keep this promise made when I agreed to marry her. They reconcile, they marry, and of course they stay married.
Yeah.
But on the issue of slavery, he hated slavery, but he also, as a master politician, knew he couldn't come out as an abolitionist early on. It was going to take time. And so that's why the first inaugural address, he's saying, you guys in the South, you'll get to keep your slaves. We just don't want them in the Western territories. We don't want slavery to expand. But then over the course of the war, and of course the turning point is the Emancipation Proclamation. And that truly changed the whole outcome of the war and pushes him toward the 13th Amendment and the elimination of slavery and keeping that promise, which had started in New Orleans when he took that riverboat down and saw slaves being auctioned and going, I can't deal with this. I can't deal with this. This is as wrong as anything can be. Someday I'm going to do something about it. And he kept that promise to himself.
Let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt, who is one of my favorite presidents. I think, and I'd like your input. Do you see shades of Theodore Roosevelt in Donald Trump?
Well, they're both men of action.
And New Yorkers.
And New Yorkers. And so you can say that they had high ambition. They wanted to make the most of their presidency. Theodore Roosevelt is highly regarded from a historical standpoint because during his almost 8 years, there wasn't a war, there wasn't a depression, and yet he's regarded as a great president. Why? In large part because he expanded the presidency. Panama Canal, busting the trust, national parks, intervening in the coal strike. All of these things, finding ways where Congress was not dealing with what needed to be done. And so he said, as a president, he was big on executive orders. So there are comparisons between the desire to expand the presidency, for the president to be more impactful, for an impatience and almost disregard of Congress.
And that thrilling excitement that Roosevelt would generate. I mean, you see the pictures of him in front of crowds standing on a carriage or something and yelling out, and there are thousands of people. That electricity is something that we really haven't seen in a good while. I mean, you had Obama. We did see it with Obama. But Trump is something different.
Well, you saw it with John F. Kennedy. You saw it with Ronald Reagan. You saw it with Franklin Roosevelt. And we've had eloquent presidents. But Trump certainly has his supporters where he wants them. They cheer his every sentence, whether it's trying to be funny. Sometimes you don't know whether he's telling jokes or not. But in any case, his supporters are all in, seemingly on every issue with very few exceptions.
Tell me about Roosevelt. One of the things that I've always loved about him, first of all, he wrote, 35 books on naval history, on natural history. I mean, the man was, but you somewhere in the book, or maybe I read it elsewhere, he's described as swelling with knowledge. He absorbed knowledge. He's this explorer. He's always trying to, dive in and absorb all he can. How do we do that? Why is that important for any leader?
Well, it helps to have a photographic memory. And Theodore Roosevelt, like Abraham Lincoln, had that. He could read a highly technical book 10 years ago and still be able to recall with the specifics of what he had read. So I say he's our highest IQ president. He wrote more books than any president. He read more books than any president, and he could quote them all. So it's always great to be brilliant if you're in a leadership position, and he was certainly that. Back to the point on Jefferson, if you're going to have vision, you've got to think of many different options and choose the best one. And if you have more knowledge, then you know of that many more options that you might consider before you make the final decision.
And I love Roosevelt. You write in your book that he read, he reflected, and then he wrote. And when you follow that pattern of reading, reflection, and writing, the writing does cement it in your soul somehow. I mean, you know this as a writer. Once you've absorbed that much and you've spent that much time with it, it does brand itself, and it will lead you in a different way.
Well, the beauty of writing, and the reason I do it, is because it brings closure. You've got all this information bouncing around in your head, and yet if you don't take the time to put it into writing, your final thoughts with multiple revisions, bouncing it off your friends before it goes to the publisher to make sure that you've hit the nail on the head. But that's the reason I write, to bring closure to my thoughts, that if I didn't stop to write it down, they'd just keep bouncing around in my head.
Roosevelt's a great inspiration for that, to take the time. In fact, when you go to the house, when you go to the old Roosevelt house, which is a recreation in New York, the house has been torn down, they rebuilt it, but it's an exact replica. There is the actual little velvet chair that Roosevelt would read in as a child. Because of the asthma, he couldn't get out, he couldn't run around. But he immersed himself in a world of imagination and ideas. And it was on that little velvet chair, really, where the entire future of the United States was hatched. It was there that he first saw the buffalo and saw those images. I mean, it's an amazing, the power of the mind and reading and visuals. So important.
Well, there are famous photographs of Theodore Roosevelt when he would go on these trips abroad or wherever. He'd take 35 books with him, and he'd read a book a day or every 2 days. I mean, he never stopped reading. He was a compulsive reader because he's a compulsive learner. And if you're going to be a leader, it's good to always be in a learning mode.
Love that. Tell me about this line of Theodore Roosevelt where he said, "Don't hit till you have to, but when you hit hard."
Well, it aligns with speak softly and carry a big stick. I mean, the premise is clear. There's no need to hit hard unless it's absolutely necessary. But if you decide it is necessary, then go for it.
Take it down.
Take it down. Knock him out. Not a TKO, the whole KO.
Yeah.
And that was his whole mindset. And you know, a lot of people embraced it. Unfortunately, the last 10 years of his life after he left the presidency, he made a lot of enemies, and his taking down others, his batting average went way down.
Yeah, he kind of demolished a bit of his, damaged his reputation. Didn't demolish it, damaged it. Tell me about the lesson, the cautionary tale in Theodore Roosevelt, which I have to tell you, I read that whole, what was the great 3-book biography?
Edmund Morris.
By Edmund Morris.
The trilogy.
Yeah. And I was so lost in the narrative, I didn't really see or spend any time thinking about the cautionary tale of Theodore Roosevelt, about burnout,
right,
overdoing it.
Yeah, he ran his engine too hard, too long, and ultimately it impacted his decisions. Most notably, when Woodrow Wilson's president, World War I's going on, TR wants the U.S. to join the war. He leans on Wilson. We finally do. TR goes to the White House and says, "I'm 58 years old, but I want to have another set of Rough Riders and go over to World War I." And Wilson says, "I don't think so. I'm not going to permit that. You're too old." So then Roosevelt goes home and he pushes all of his sons to the front lines, one of whom is killed, another of whom is badly injured. I mean, all kinds of bad stuff. And that maybe the main reason he died at such a young age, a broken heart. He finally realized this wasn't the right thing to do for my sons, and the guilt associated with that. So he was in an overload mind, fortunately, after the presidency, not during the presidency when he was absolutely in his prime.
Wow. We'll return to our interview in just a moment, but if I asked you which president first popularized ice cream, you'd probably say Joe Biden, but you'd be wrong. It goes much, much further back than that. And wait until you hear how it ends. In the 17th and 18th century, French cookbooks started to feature recipes for ice cream. Now, they consisted mostly of egg yolks and cream and sugar. Ice cream had come into fashion by 1784. That was the year that an American statesman was sent to France on a diplomatic mission. And while dining there, he must have been taken by the dessert, going so far as to request the recipe. He wrote it in his own hand, as a matter of fact. We still have the copy. He became, in fact, the first American to ever write a recipe for ice cream out and bring it back to the United States. And wait until you hear how it ends. Back to how it ends. So in 1789, the American diplomat who had written the first recipe for ice cream returns to the United States, and among the things he returned home with were 4 ice molds from France. Fast forward, to 1801, and that American diplomat, one Thomas Jefferson, is elected president. Dinner guests at the White House noted that on at least 6 different occasions, and you can find this in their diaries or letters, Jefferson served ice cream in a crust or pastry during White House suppers. If he didn't introduce ice cream to the country, Jefferson certainly popularized and spread love of the dessert among his fellow countrymen. And Jefferson's chef throughout his presidency, a man named Honoré Julian, in 1810, opened his own confectionery shop in Washington, D.C. He would go on to sell ice cream every Wednesday and Sunday during the warm season. Thomas Jefferson was truly committed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of frozen sweetness. And that's how it ends. Something to think about next time you reach for a cone. Now back to Talmadge Boston and what FDR and Ronald Reagan can teach us about the power of words. Let's talk about FDR for a minute. Wrestled with polio. What does his dealing with polio while in office and the ravages of it teach any leader about dealing with personal setbacks, special needs, or just mental struggles?
Well, the lesson of FDR and polio is that your obstacles can be overcome, and you will be, in most instances, a better person because of the perseverance you showed, because of how it changed your personality many times for the better. Yeah. After he got polio, all of a sudden he was more patient, he was more empathetic, thus he related to the American people that much better. His voice in the fireside chats, people felt like this is somebody I could listen to all day because of that empathy in his voice, but also the fact that he was so committed to grasping the public sentiment, constant press conferences, constant trips across the country, brand new public opinion polls he's wired in on. So he's doing everything he can to grasp where's the public sentiment and how do I need to shape it for the ultimate good, as he did in the late 30s and early 40s. America's isolationist. Yeah. They don't want to go to World War II.
And they're broke.
And they're broke, but they're led by American hero Charles Lindbergh and FDR and those fireside chats. Look, folks, this is not about war. This is about national security. If we don't do something, this Hitler guy's going to take out Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, the high seas, and he's coming for us. And so are we just going to sit back and let him get a foothold in this hemisphere and God knows what's going to happen then? Or are we going to do what we need to do to put him down before he comes and attacks
So
us?
the lesson for leaders is take the time to convince everybody. Read the room and bend it to your way of thinking if you can.
And don't think you can get it all done in the first conversation. It almost goes back to Lincoln, where he's not saying on day one, I'm an abolitionist, we need to eliminate slavery now. FDR wasn't saying, we got to end isolationism now. If he had, it would have ticked most people off.
Right.
You do it gradually, and they come around. The more they hear you, the more they believe in you, they start to rethink their position.
I want to talk about Eisenhower for a moment, who Eisenhower has a favorite quote that I pulled from your book, and it's Helmut von Moltke. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He says, centralization is the refuge of fear. That was one of Ike's favorite quotes. How did that idea shape the way he set up his organization, whether on the battlefield or in the White House? And what can we get from that, learn from that?
Well, Eisenhower knew that to take on the responsibilities he had, whether it was as Supreme Allied Commander during World War II or as President of the United States, he had to establish an organization, he had to delegate to top people and allow them to do their jobs, and yes, supervise them to make sure they were staying in their lanes and doing their jobs, but a master organizer, both as a war leader but also as president. In his presidency in particular, how he handled his cabinet, his National Security Council, his Office of Congressional Liaison, they all did their own thing, but he had regular meetings with him, brainstorming sessions with him, debates with him. They're in the loop and he's in theirs. He's the ultimate decision maker, but he is not in any way in an information vacuum. He's constantly absorbing information to make sure he knows what the best thing for America is.
And Friday meetings were mandatory for the cabinet.
You don't miss meetings with the President of the United States.
Well, but some presidents don't have regular cabinet meetings, which you need. You need if you're going to have any kind of structure or advance a vision. And I guess that's Ike's. This really leapt out to me when I read your book. He really took those lessons of the battlefield, which were gutsy decisions. D-Day, I mean, my Lord, who would want to make that call? But he did. And it was, thank God, it was successful. But he really does transplant the war model on the White House and brings us peace and prosperity.
Well, think about it. Think about it. Here he comes in. Truman gets us into Korea, has no idea how to get us out. Eisenhower, running for president in 1952, says, I will go to Korea. He does. And within 6 months, the war is over. McCarthyism running rampant under Truman. He comes in. Within a year, he gets that knocked out. Little Rock, 1957, in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education. He sends in the Army and the military to enforce the Supreme Court order of integration of the public schools. So a very bold leader, but getting back to your point about he didn't get bold until he had to be, but when he had to be, he was bold.
Well, D-Day, he waits and he waits and he waits. The weather's lousy and they wait, and then this is our moment to go. Speak for a moment about the patience of Dwight D. Eisenhower and how that served him at the Suez Canal. And I guess Lincoln was another favorite of Eisenhower's as well.
No, he had a bust of Lincoln at Gettysburg at his home. But anybody who's been a war leader knows you better have the right timing before you make your moves. Mm-hmm. If you're premature, you're going to fail. And so this sense of optimum timing was a big part. And that's just being wise. That's part of being an effective leader. And if you're impatient and impulsive, then don't expect anything good to happen. Mm-hmm. And so Eisenhower grasped that. Although there are times when you got to move quickly. In that Suez situation, here's England, France, Israel, our allies have invaded Egypt, seized the Suez Canal. Eisenhower told them beforehand, don't do that. That's going to invite the Soviet Union into the Middle East. It's going to disrupt the balance of power. Don't do that. And they did it anyway. So as soon as they did it, boom, he's at the UN. He gets huge sanctions imposed against him. And ultimately, they get out very quickly after he plays hardball.
We forget about Eisenhower, what a great president he was, and the period of peace he gave us. He's one of the few, I guess just Ike and Trump really are the only presidents in the last, what is it, 50 years, 60 years, who gave us peace. We didn't actually have a war that they initiated. That's a pretty amazing thing.
Well, anytime you can achieve peace, that's great. Of course, Trump has had his first term, and there was no war during that, and he's at the start of his second term. We're keeping our fingers crossed. We don't want war. We'll see what the future holds.
Yeah. Let's talk about JFK and his self-possession. That was what I came away when I read that chapter in your book. The self-possession of self-mastery of JFK and how he balanced those competing interests, considering all sides. Taking the time to consider all sides. Talk to me about that and the importance of that to a leader.
Well, he started his presidency with a total disaster in the Bay of Pigs. And he'd been in office 3 months, and he followed the advice of his military advisors. The Joint Chiefs of Staff at all says, oh yeah, this is going to work. We're going to send these guerrillas we've been training in Central America. We're going to send them. All these Cubans don't like Cuba, and when the guerrillas arrive, the citizens are going to rise up. They're going to overthrow Cuba. It'll all be great. Wrong. The guerrillas were outmanned. The Cuban soldiers defeated them immediately, and Kennedy gets on national TV and tells the American people, I screwed up. I didn't fully study this. I'm taking the blame. I've learned my lessons. And 18 months later, he proves with the Cuban Missile Crisis not to rubber stamp and accept the advice of your military leaders. Make your own decisions. Gather more information. And obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis is the great success story of the short Kennedy presidency, eliminating the threat of nuclear Armageddon and World War III because he had his own bearings and was not dependent on those who were so-called experts who in fact did not have the big picture necessary to make the best decision.
Tell me about the power of ideas, though, and you highlight this in your book. I mean, the space program, the Peace Corps. John F. Kennedy was sort of dreaming with the rhetoric, dreaming large and pulling the country into that. Why is that so critical for a leader, and what can we take from his example?
Well, there's always going to be big issues, and either you're going to take them on and find ways to move the public needle toward where it needs to be, as FDR did with isolationism, but Kennedy in particular, that first inaugural address, the need during the Cold War to get young people out into third world countries, demonstrate that America's a great country, wants to help the world, great PR. A year later, the space race, we're losing. Congress isn't providing the funds. He makes the speech at Rice Stadium. We're going to send a man to the moon by the end of this decade to show the world how smart and capable we are. And Congress starts awarding the money. But most importantly is civil rights. Until Kennedy came along in the summer of 1963 after Birmingham, people thought of civil rights, it's just a political issue. Kennedy said, no, it is a moral issue. It is our moral responsibility. He then submits a strong civil rights bill, which Lyndon Johnson ultimately pushes through. But it's this vision and capacity to get the public to embrace the vision through the power of his words and eloquence. And Kennedy was as good as FDR, Lincoln, and Reagan.
Wow. And I'm glad that's a great segue to Reagan. I mean, obviously, we both saw Reagan, I grew up watching Reagan, met him a few times. The rhetoric, the power of rhetoric with Reagan. And he had those lines that he used again and again. It can be done. He used to have the little plaque on the desk, the shining city on a hill. Tell me about the importance of a credo, of a stated articulation of belief, the evil empire. America's greatest days are still ahead of it. It's morning in America. The power of those ideas articulated in a statement again and again by a leader.
Well, credos are easy to remember. It can be done. Shining city on a hill. But the thing about Reagan, all those credos were inspired by his inner sense of optimism. Not only was he optimistic, but this capacity to inspire the country to be optimistic, which is why after the disastrous presidency of Jimmy Carter, Reagan runs in 1980, and he gets 44 out of 50 states. And there's tons of Reagan Democrats because the country is sharing his optimistic vision of a shining city on the hill and thinks he can pull it off. And in fact, he does.
No, his optimism and his spirit. He was a believer. I mean, there was the religious belief underneath it that sort of fueled and I think drove those big initiatives, particularly taking on the Soviet Empire and bringing it to its knees and marshaling with John Paul II, with Maggie Thatcher. I mean, that was a spiritual crusade as much as it was a political one. It was an interesting balance, and that's a hard thing to pull off as a president.
Well, Reagan built those relationships that you just mentioned, and obviously they were the key to his success. And I think that's the key to success of our greatest presidents. They knew how to work with world leaders. They knew how to work with congressional leaders. Reagan was great about going across the aisle. He famously said, compromise is necessary. I'd rather get 80% of what I want than go over the cliff with my flag flying. And too many people these days think compromise is a cuss word, and that if you're thinking in terms of compromise, then you're not a true believer. And that's a perspective for making government unsuccessful and gridlocked.
Tell me about holding fast in opposition. There's a great moment where Reagan is going to the Berlin Wall, and there's a line that was almost unsaid, and it's the line we all remember. Right. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. That was not, it was taken out of the speech. He wrote it back in.
That's one good thing about being president. I mean, I get the question a lot saying, hey, in this era, presidents, they have speech writers, so how much do they really do? Well, the presidents have the power of editing, and they get to approve the final draft. And Reagan was insistent that no matter what his State Department officials said or anybody else, I'm sticking with that line. I want to say that in Mr. Gorbachev's presence. And those are the most important words he said in his entire presidency, and was the key turning point toward bringing an end to the Cold War.
So the lesson there is sometimes sticking by your guns and your gut.
The people elected you to be president. Say your words. Don't rely on others if they are not what you want to say. That is your power. You get to pick the words.
Why do you keep doing this?
Because it's so much fun. And because it's...
I mean, this is really, it's more than a hobby. This is an obsession for you.
Well, it's a passion. I tell people my mission is to spread a love of history throughout the Dallas area where I live, but nationally through my podcast series.
Cross-examining
history through my podcast. I speak all over the country. I'm a contributing columnist for the Dallas Morning News, which has a high circulation. So I like to spread the fact that there's so much we can learn from history if people would just stop and think about, yes, it can be applied today and it should be.
Okay. There are a series of Arroyo Grande questions I ask everybody who sits opposite me. So these are quick questions, quick answers. You ready? You're okay, Talmadge?
Yeah.
Okay, brace yourself. Who's the person you most admire?
Abraham Lincoln.
Who's the person you most detest?
Hitler.
Okay, that was an easy one. I hear that a lot. What is your best feature?
I'm good at bringing people together in all kinds of groups, and I enjoy bringing people together.
What do you fear?
I fear people not being open-minded and being boxed into ideas without the reflection that's needed to draw good conclusions.
Oh boy, I share that fear. I share that fear. What do you know that others don't know?
I know how important relationship building is and what it takes over time to bring to fruition that and the bountiful results that come from having positive relationships. We live in a world with all the social media and everybody living on their phones and so forth. People are not aggressive about building relationships, and it causes loneliness and depression, and I don't have any of that because I'm always in a mode of
Engagement
with new folks, but also building on what I have with my longtime friends.
What's the best piece of advice you ever got?
Tell the truth, love one another, do unto others as you like them to do unto you. I mean, it's all straight from the Bible.
Mm-hmm. What happens when this is over?
When my life is over? Well, I'll go to heaven and feel like, you go to a lot of funerals, and you do and I do, and you like it when somebody says, when so-and-so got up there, well done, good and faithful service. Mm-hmm. You gave it your best. You fulfilled your potential. Mm-hmm. You had worthwhile goals, and for the most part, you fulfilled them. Yeah, you had setbacks. Yeah, you sinned. Yeah, you did some stupid things. But overall, you made a positive difference in the lives of many.
Talmadge Boston, thank you for the time. Thank you for the book, How the Best Did It. And you're the best. Thank you.
Okay. My pleasure.
Great job.
My pleasure. Thank you, Raymond.
Wow. Okay, here's the haul. Did you note the string that ran through all those presidents we talked about? They knew how to engage other leaders and build relationships with them, whether they did it at a dinner table one-on-one like Jefferson or with the power of public rhetoric like Ronald Reagan. They knew how to win people over and lead them in a new direction. And I guess I just didn't appreciate how the president's personal liabilities, the things they lacked, shaped so many approaches here. The personal dinners for Jefferson, the reliance on technology for FDR because he didn't have the physical ability to appear in person. What it tells me is this: if the purpose is high enough and you are committed enough, liabilities can be turned into assets, and assets that even define your work for the next generation. Thanks to Talmadge Boston for his insights and those great stories. And I hope you'll come back to Arroyo Grande soon. Why live a dry, narrow, constricted life when if you fill it with good things, it can flow into a broad, thriving Arroyo Grande. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Make sure you subscribe and like this episode. Thanks for diving in, and we'll see you next time. Bye now. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and Divine Providence Studios, and it's available at YouTube, the iHeart Radio app, or wherever you get your podcasts.